Massimo is professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova, and he's also a contributing editor at Commonweal magazine. He received his PhD in religious history from the University of Turin in 2002. Early research projects include work at the Foundation for Religious at John the 23rd in Bologna from 1996 to 2008. And these days, it seems to me, helped him develop into perhaps the most preeminent voice on the legacy of Vatican II that we have today. His books and articles have been published in 8 languages. His recent publications include Vatican II, The Battle for Meaning. That was the first book I read by Massimo. It was a sea change of a book. True Reform, Liturgy and Ecclesiology and Sacrosanctum Concilium. Sorting Out Catholicism, A Brief History of the New Ecclesial Movements. Both those last 2 are from Liturgical Press. Pope Francis, Tradition and Transition from Paulus in 2015. A Council for the Global Church, Receiving Vatican II in History, Fortress, 2015. And Rising Laity, Ecclesial Movements Since Vatican II from Paulus Press, just here in 2016. You can see it's quite a list, especially in a short time. And it gives us a glimpse into Massimo's work ethic, his native skill, his range, and more. For my part, I always enjoy hearing Massimo speak about the church in America, and I've come to view him as kind of the Alexis de Tocqueville of the American church, a European who supplies so many astute and needed insights about American church and culture. Now, he may have a leg up on de Tocqueville in this one regard, as he is married to an American. His wife, Sarah, is from Oregon. So without further ado, let's welcome Massimo to the stage and or the podium, and thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. I always come back with great joy to Chicago. One reason is because I got married in Chicago, so that was. But the second reason, and that has to do with Loyola, is that I was here the first Thursday or Friday of April of 2016, the very day Amoris Laetitia was published, and on Monday we have the new exhortation. So it's becoming, kind of a tradition. So I am very happy to be here and to discuss with my colleagues with whom we have interacted last week before Villanova won the championship. So sorry about that. So here, what I'm going to do is to divide my observations about 5 years of Francis in 3 parts. The first part will be more theological, so what Francis has done that is significant theologically. The second part, more specific about the ecclesiology of Pope Francis, his vision of the church. And the third one, even more specific, about the geopolitical aspect of this pontificate after 5 years. So here, the first thing that it's kind of obvious, but not really, is that one of the things that makes of this pontificate a very important one is that it has become more clear than before that being Pope is about being a Christian, and it's about the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that and with this, I don't mean in any way that he is a Christian and his predecessors were not. I mean, it has nothing to do with that. But being Pope with Francis has become more visibly not something about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It has become something of the gospel of Jesus Christ. As you know, reconciling the papal ministry, the Vatican, the Roman Curia with the gospel, it can be quite a challenge for a number of reasons. So this pontificate is appealing, first of all, for that, I think. There's a second reason that in the recent history of the theology makes of this pontificate something very interesting, is that Pope Francis has challenged, I don't know how consciously, I think quite consciously, but maybe not completely aware of the consequences, has challenged something that had become something like a mantra in the early 2000s, which is the mantra of the hermeneutic of continuity. I think it's impossible to understand Catholicism, the Catholic Church, theology, the tradition, in terms of continuity versus discontinuity. This has been one of the biggest misunderstandings that followed the speech of Pope Benedict in 2005. So Francis has clearly made a case for the impossibility to frame Catholicism in terms of continuity versus discontinuity. He has said that a few times directly, but mostly indirectly. So what he has said, and he has made clear in many ways, is that the most important continuity that the Church must have is with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the continuity with the gospel of Jesus Christ requires some kind of discontinuity with the previous history of the Catholic Church. And this is something uncomfortable, it's something that can be risky, and it is risky. But the interesting thing of Francis, theologically, is that he's challenging the idea that there is a continuity that is Catholic, and a discontinuity that is non-Catholic, or heretic, or liberal, or whatever. He has basically said this, that Christianity and Catholicism, in Catholicism, Christianity is not something that is accomplished, that has been accomplished at some point in the past, recent past or distant past. It's something that needs to be realized. And to do that, to continue to, in this effort, we shouldn't be afraid of acknowledging that there are some discontinuities in the way we do things, in the way we say things, in the way we think things. So this is, for a theologian, a tautology. It's not big news. It's different when the Pope says that. So this is the interesting thing. So as an academic theologian, sometimes I think Francis should have been able to create more bridges with academic theologians, signaling more closeness between his theology and those who are theologians by profession. At the same time, he has made a very clear argument for the theological essence of his pontificate, which is not obvious for the papacy. So, and this is interesting because one of the difficulties of this pontificate is that it has arrived at a particular moment in church history, which means after the pontificate of one of the most important theologians of the 20th century. So it was a very hard act to follow. And he has done that in his own way, with a language that is interesting in addressing this involution of how Catholics have talked about history and the tradition, especially since the early 2000s. So that's the first point. Second point is this, is that Francis has made clear that it's not that his pontificate is not about changing the church, to paraphrase an interesting book that has been published recently, but it's a church that has always changed. This is interesting because Francis, in something that is counterintuitive for the Bishop of Rome, for how we understand the role of being Pope, is more afraid of a sense of dead quiet than of chaos. This is, in this, he has challenged significant assumptions that Catholics have been educated in. That being a Catholic is for a sense of order. So this is not Francis. So this is very interesting, I think, not just from a cultural point of view, but from a theological point of view. How much interruption Christianity needs to be Christian, and how much quiet can disguise hypocrisy and a certain sense of complacency. So in this, Francis has really challenged many assumptions that we had about Catholicism. A third thing that is interesting in the way Francis has changed our assumptions on Catholicism is that he has obviously reversed a few positions in the ideological spectrum of Catholics. I mean, those who used to be liberal Catholics until 2013 now tend to be ultramontanists, and those who are ultramontanists now tend to be liberal Catholics. So this is obvious. One less obvious thing is that, and in this Francis has been very open in encouraging discussion, is that a more conservative Catholic culture that for a few decades had become used to not using the tools of critical thinking, looking at the papal teaching, now has been pushed to become critical again of papal teaching by a pope that they don't like. This is quite remarkable. It is quite remarkable. So here, I think we should welcome the return of critical thinking in some quarters of the Catholic Church, where critical thinking had been described in the last few decades as disloyal, disrespectful. I think this moment is, in some days, especially if you are on Twitter, can be depressing. But at the same time, it's a kairos, I think, because it's a rebalancing of what it means to be faithful, what it means to be critical. So we are discovering the complexity of these ideas. Now, there's no question that the most critical moment and point of this pontificate has been that period of time between the two synods of the bishops, 2014-2015, and the publication of Amoris Laetitia following the two synods in April 2016. So this is, for certain, the most critical and I think the most revealing moment of this pontificate, because Francis, who I believe is very much a Vatican II Pope, a post-Vatican II Pope, in a different way from John Paul and from Benedict, here Francis has shown, I think, a remarkable freedom from that foundational event, Vatican II and the post-Vatican II, in addressing one theological issue, which is the relationship between the gospel and the law. And Vatican II was, I would say, overly confident in the fact that the gospel can permeate the law of the church, first of all, and that there can be no real tension, no real contradiction between the law and the gospel. As you remember probably, so one of the most interesting acts of John Paul II, 1983, the publication of the new Code of Canon Law, is that this law is an expression of the Second Vatican Council. And he used infallibility to approve that, by the way. So here Francis, I think, has shown a different theology, saying there is a fundamental tension between the gospel and the law. And we should embrace that tension. We shouldn't solve that tension completely. So this is fascinating of the way Francis thinks. He thinks that the whole Catholic genius is keeping things in tension without solving completely that tension. Because if you solve that tension, you will destroy that delicate balance. It is like a dancer. It stays alive if it keeps dancing. If it finds a place where all the balances, weights are settled, it's not moving anymore. So in this sense, law and gospel is interesting, and that makes of Pope Francis not a liberal pope. Because liberal Catholicism is that liberalism that is associated with Vatican II is usually associated with the naive optimism that the gospel will be accepted in the world and in the church, everything will be absorbed by the force of the gospel. Here Francis has a different idea. And I think that the whole debate on marriage and divorce, it's about how much the church can live with the law alone, and how much the gospel can be a balancing factor of the legal element which is necessary. So one of the things that went unnoticed in this pontificate is that Francis has legislated a lot. So one canon lawyer from Germany counted, and he legislated on average per year 50% more than Pope Benedict. He believes in the law. I mean, he's not an improviser, but he thinks the whole discourse right now needs to be rebalanced with the gospel, which is really part of his understanding of why Vatican II is important. So here again, one of the biggest differences between Francis and his predecessors, obviously, is that he was not at Vatican II. In his biography, Vatican II is before he becomes a Jesuit, he becomes a priest, and so on. But the important thing is that for him, there is no good Vatican II and bad post-Vatican II. There is no good theology of the Second Vatican Council and a bad interpretation of the... For him, there is a history of these last 50 years that is all part of the path of the church. In this, it's one, I think, of the differences with his predecessors. There's no questions about that. He is not afraid of embracing the post-Vatican II, because it's easy to say, I like Vatican II. It's more difficult in some countries to say, I think the 1970s were good. It's more difficult. It's more divisive. In this, there is the whole difference between the Catholic experience of Latin America and of North America and of Europe. This is a huge gap that cannot be bridged easily. So here, we tend to isolate the fact that he's the first non-European pope into the geopolitical side and so on. But there is a theological element here of the first bishop of Rome who never studied in Rome, who never worked in Rome, who's not part of the Euro-Mediterranean. It's a big shift, like when Christianity shifts from Northern Africa to Europe. It's not European theology in the 6th, 7th, 8th century is not more liberal or more, it's a different animal. And here, I think this is part of the history of the church. In Francis, there is an idea that the ideas in the church and this tradition moves on the world map. And what we see with this Pope is a monumental shift of theology from Europe to the global south. And I don't think that can be reverted. Even if you elect an Italian Pope next time, it cannot be reverted. And so in this Francis is a great sign of our time. In this sense, as an historian of the Second Vatican Council, in these last few years, I received many blessings. One was that my first 5 years in the US were under Benedict, and the other 5 years were under Francis. That was a great gift for me to be here and to see that shift from one pope to another. Also to understand one thing is that the whole debate about Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia is fundamentally another version or a subset of the debate and, as we have seen lately, a subset of the opposition to the Second Vatican Council. I have to be honest here. So this church in the US is a Vatican II church. It's also a church and a theological tradition that in these last 50 years has not produced a series of commentaries on the Second Vatican Council that have been published in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Korea, and not in the richest of the churches in the Western world. So this says something, I think. So this pontificate, I think, cannot be interpreted without the context of the Second Vatican Council, and finally cannot be interpreted in light of something that I think cannot be ignored, that in this church, in this Catholic Church, in this moment, in the world of this time, we are witnessing a return of a Catholic traditionalism that, more or less like the secularization thesis, most enlightened intellectuals assumed it was dead for good. It is back. And it's something that I don't think will be reabsorbed. As a church historian, I think the future of the Church of the Second Vatican Council will have to deal with a more complicated map of theological identities than the one we assumed until a few years ago. So this is something that Benedict had. had to deal with in his own way, but Francis had to challenge that very direct frontally. This is something new of these last few years. Second and third part, much shorter. The ecclesiology of Pope Francis. What's important and significant, I think, in the ecclesiology of Pope Francis? It's this. One of the gaps between Francis' interpretation of the Second Vatican Council and of Francis' vision of the Church of today is basically this, is that Vatican II has a simpler idea of the Church and of the relationship between the Church and the world. If you read Gaudium et Spes, if you read Lumen Gentium, and the whole ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, you can draw a picture of a sphere, or if you are really complicated, of an ellipsis. It's a more rounded up object. Now, Francis doesn't use the image of the sphere. He used the polyhedron. It's a much more complicated picture of the Church. In this, Francis has a vision of the Church that is a little different. It's more complicated. The relationship Church-world is less optimistic, I would say, is more tempered by what happened in these last 50 years. So here, the shift from the language of the sphere, of this idea of the communion that has produced undifferentiated identities. That was more or less the idea of the Second Vatican Council. In Francis, he says, we have a picture of the Church in the modern world that is made of many different faces that are all different. And this is a different picture of the Catholic Church. Ecclesiologically, another step that Francis has made from Vatican II is that Vatican II articulates the discourse on collegiality. He says nothing on synodality. There's something in the document on the bishops, on the synods, or local synods, diocesan synods, and on the bishop's synod, but they are another way of saying we need collegiality, locally and universally. Francis has made a huge step saying we need collegiality, which applies to bishops, but we need synodality. So we need a church that is able to talk about among members of the church, and it doesn't matter if they have a mitre, if they have a collar, or if they are the 98% of the church. So in this sense, Francis, in the speech of 2015 at the end of the Synod of 2015, on synodality, has articulated a vision of synodality that in the official magisterium didn't exist before. And what is interesting is that Francis, in that famous speech, which I think is one of the most important of the pontificate, he says, the Catholic Church has the mission of giving the world an example of how to make decisions in a way that is different in a world where decisions are made more and more by small groups of people. There's a huge political awareness of why synodality is not just to keep the lay people quiet, but it is part of the evangelization of the Catholic Church and of its role in this world. There are two elements that are more problematic of this pontificate and that are open questions, I think, in terms of his pontificate. How much this pontificate is decentralizing the church? It's not really clear so far. He has made especially two decisions, one on the authority of local bishops in the processes of marriage annulment, and the other on the authority of the bishops for liturgical translations. It's not that much, honestly. Decentralization is something that he thinks is necessary. It's certainly not part of the top priorities of this Pope. He doesn't believe that an investment of the Church in decentralizing structures is worth it. That has disappointed some of his fans, just like the whole project of the reform of the Roman Curia. In 2013, they said, we will have an apostolic constitution for the reform of the Roman Curia in 2015. 2015, they said 2016. 2016 said 2017. 2017 said, we have no apostolic constitution. So this is interesting. So I think there's something that happened in this pontificate. They tried that. I think they had some bad experiences with some smaller reforms, especially finances and communication. And I think they changed their mind. So this is something that, as an historian, I find interesting. So we don't know if we will have a reform of the Roman Curia. The important thing is that Francis doesn't believe in a reform of the bureaucracy. He believes in the reform of the bureaucrats, which is a different kind of thing. So here, there are many more things that one could say about his ecclesiology. Last 5 minutes on the political and geopolitical aspects, very briefly. Pope Francis has challenged the two-party system that has infiltrated the American Catholic Church. I don't know if I can be more blunt, but that has been the biggest challenge for many American Catholics. It cannot be framed in the two boxes of liberal conservative, first. Second, he is a pope who looks at the world, especially from the peripheries. If you look at where he has been in his trips, they're all peripheric. So even European countries, Albania, Greece, Sweden, it is remarkable. And so there's no France, there's no Germany. It's interesting. Third, for him, America is not that important in the world, which is a big change from John Paul II, Benedict, and even Paul VI. So for him, there's no exceptional mission of the United States. There's no exceptional role of the American Catholicism. So this is something that has created, I think, part of the resistance. He's a pope that has to face different kind of geopolitical winds in a world that is becoming more nationalist, more ethno-nationalist, where we see this new fashion of the strongman. All major countries in the world have strongmen or men who think they are strong. India, China, Russia, the United States. It is remarkable. It's not the world of John Paul II or even Benedict. So in this sense, Francis has in front of him of his face a different kind of church. And last point, he is dealing with a global church where we now see globalization with its discontents. We have been disabused of the idea that a more global church is a better church. Maybe. It's also much more complicated. Way, way more complicated. How to deal with Catholics in China, in India, where the biggest issue is Laudato Si and not Amoris Laetitia, for sure. So it's a more complicated church. So this papacy is very, very interesting from many, many points of view. I would be tempted to say that these last 5 years have passed much more quickly than 5 years. I cannot say that. It has been a very interesting time, but also difficult. I'm being honest here. It is a pontificate that is more challenging to follow, and as a theologian, to support. As a Catholic theologian, especially in this country, but it has been a great, great blessing. And so I feel very lucky also to share this with you and with my colleagues. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.